Recording. All right, welcome, my friends. Today's the day, or the night, or the morning, depending on where in the world you happen to be located. We are going to finish this essay. It is going to happen tonight. We are now on page, I think, 58 or 59 of 67. And now it's just bombshell solution orientation. We've been through a lot of epistemology, a lot of history, the clash of the two sciences, the different modalities of thinking, both in the sciences as well as in political economy, as well as in artistic expression. And we also were introduced to the different way that these different various diverse fields are really integrated and one. Except with the caveat being, if you're an oligarchist, you will see these interconnected ones in such a way that you will want to pervert them and induce them to have such an effect that when people engage in science, it makes their minds, their capacities to use creative reasoning with their emotions duller and duller and duller, to the point that people are just memorizing formulas or techniques without understanding the creative life essence that gave birth to those eurekas that had as shadows formulas. Or if you're an artist, increasingly you're encouraged to give way and submit entirely to the dominance of your random emotional states, devoid and detached from any coherence with reason, logic, ideas that are coherent. So this schisming of the person, of each individual within themselves, is tied to the schisming of society as a whole, and how a society can be kept divided to be better conquered. It starts with the heart. So we were introduced to this in a whole bunch of ways, but now we're at practical solutions, like what needs to be done. Says LaRouche in 2001, I think again, November, December 2001, to avoid the consequences of a new prolonged dark age. Well, short or long, who knows? But the point is a collapse of the system with everything that goes with that. So what is needed practically, policy-wise? So we're going to look at some of those examples today. Let me do a little screen share. Ba-ba-bum. Okay, I've just done a screen share. Can people see the PDF?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, make it nice and big. And do people want the words bigger, or is this okay?
You got one bigger.
Yeah.
I can do that. Is that okay?
There we are.
Bueno. All right. So we are at section B on money, credit, finance, prices, and taxation. This probably won't be as dry as it sounds, I would imagine, knowing LaRouche's style. Who would like to be today's voice?
I'm always willing.
And you're always accepted. All right.
Well, bravo. Money, credit, finance, prices, and taxation. Once we have adopted the improved view of Vernadsky's noosphere, which I have freshly summarized in the preceding chapter, there should be no remaining intellectual obstacle to recognizing that the basis for economic processes lies within the bounds of a science of physical economy. It is sufficient to include the recognition, cognitive discovery of universal physical principles, also subsume the physical effects produced by the conceptions associated with classical humanist forms of culture. It should rise a little at this point. Oh, there we go. From this vantage point, it is but one more intellectual step of recognition to recognize that there is no natural, pure economic basis for the relative values of prices and money, but the political legal fictions arbitrarily imposed by whatever agencies have, for the moment, seized control over the affairs of a society. A summary of that issue must be inserted here, as the most efficient way to clarify the wild-eyed errors of today's popular opinion on the subject of my money. Once that error is exposed, the remainder of the argument falls rather neatly into place. In modern history, the worst among the currently widespread extremes of more or less popularized lunacy respecting economics dates from four well-known 18th century aberrations listed in the following historical sequence. First, the concept of laissez-faire by variously the Conti network's feudal ideologue Quesnay, Bernard Mandeville's Faustian theory of glory achieved through promoting vices, and the British East India Company's Adam Smith's free trade. Second, the notion of wealth created through fictitious capital gains of John Law et al. Third, the popularization of proto-Nietzschean Robinson Crusoe model as adopted during the 20th century by the infantile John von Neumann and his accomplice Oscar Morgenstern. And fourth, the deluded search for a mathematically perfected natural price of gold. The 19th century added a fifth kindred quality of delusion, the deluded search for a primeval hoard of financial capital, with or without leprechauns, as by Karl Marx. All five of these delusions have a common basis in that pathological state of mind known as the 18th century British and French Enlightenment, whose common name is the Ockhamite empiricism of Venetians Paolo Sarpi, Abbott, Antonio Conti, and their followers. Typical of that so-called Enlightenment generally is the hysterical premise of being scientific, which is to say, seeking to reduce everything to a matter of ivory tower mathematical schemes at the blackboard. What the anti-scientific ivory tower schemes of Ptolemy, Copernicus, and Brahe did in that way for astronomy was carried to an extreme as farce for economics by what von Neumann and Morgenstern did with their infantile Robinson Crusoe myth of marginal utility. Similarly, all of the economic dogmas of the five types I have derided here were invented as names for that elusive devil in the detail of statistics, that infinite pickpocket, which Adam Smith named the invisible hand, and the more honest Charles Dickens plainly renamed the principle of the artful dodger. None of these five are actually theories. They are, in fact, lunatic cults. There is nothing natural.
Just quick. For anybody listening at this point online who might just be listening to the recording, I think pretty much everyone here has heard a few of, or have been a part of the past readings. Don't be intimidated. We've been through a lot of this material already, and frankly, you shouldn't be expected to have understood every single thing he's saying and every reference he's making. Just take note of some of the key names for future reference. A whole university curriculum could be built around any given paragraph to be unpacked. But hold it in mind as a brushstroke or as a thumbnail sketch, if you will. If for people who have done like drawing a lot, a thumbnail sketch is a great way to think about some of these types of papers where you're getting broad brushstrokes, loose on detail, but broad in terms of getting the outline, the structure, and give yourself the mission over the ensuing weeks and months and years of your life to try to disprove what he's saying or prove what he's saying. Either way, see what happens. But all I'd say, don't be intimidated by some of this material.
There is nothing natural in the behavior of money in an economy. Money in modern society is a political fiction whose best possible intrinsic feature is that, when compared with barter, its use tends to facilitate trade and investment. However, its most essential role in modern society is its role as an instrument essential to maintaining the functional sovereignty of the modern nation state and its economy. The emergence of certain standards concerning the imputed functional meaning of money is chiefly the result of the hegemony of the English-speaking economies in the post-17th century world. The interaction of two English-speaking systems, the relatively hegemonic British system and the contrary American system, has given a certain general shape to what is otherwise a medley of wildly differing assumptions. The nearest approximation to a sane attempt at posing an actual theory of money is achieved by studying the way in which physical economies respond to what are predominantly arbitrary forms of monetary, fiscal, regulation of trade, and taxation policies. It happens that the US policies closest to those strictly definable as American system policies and practices present us with the nearest approximation of a practical doctrine on the management of money. Therefore, there has never been any competent theory precisely defining a way of fixing the value of a national currency. There have been arbitrary measures which intended to regulate the currency and its uses, some of which were less effective than others. For reason of the increasing role of the English language in the development of modern economy since the accession of England's Henry VII, a comparison of the development of monetary and related practices in Tudor England and the view of that Tudor experience expressed by the pre-1688 Massachusetts Bay Colony provides the best pedagogical benchmark for approaching the subject of money in a system of modern nation-state economy. The most significant example from this study of pre-18th century practices is the use of the issue of paper money within that commonwealth. The remarks of Cotton Mather and Benjamin Franklin on this subject are of essential relevance. Footnote 65.
Reference to Cotton Mather's book, this is an essay, Some Considerations on Bills of Credit, published in 1691. Benjamin Franklin's Essays on General Politics, Commerce, and Political Economy. I guess it's an accumulation of essays, I think. And then Graham Lowry's works.
They are of essential relevance. Therefore, given the array of complexities and conflicts among the ancient, medieval, and modern history of monetary and related systems, I define the broad requirements of a monetary policy from the specific standpoint of the situation of the USA in the world today, circa 2001. I emphasize the internal economy of the United States, of course, but also take into account the implications of the nature of the world around us, into which our efforts must be integrated. Since no competent theory of money per se is possible in the real world, our definitions of monetary and related processes must be grounded functionally in the science of physical economy. There is no sane form of monetary policy per se. All relatively effective forms of monetary policy are inseparable from the imposition of political conditions broadly classed under the heading of regulation. These include customs duties as such, tariff and trade regulations, both domestic and foreign generally, price regulation, and the use of taxation not only as a means of raising funds for government, but of shaping the flow of money capital within the physical economic process. Among the most relevant examples of regulation, for our purposes here, is the proper use of investment tax credits. I discuss that topic now as a way of introducing the remainder of my remarks on monetary policy. Talk among yourselves while I take a sip of water.
Yeah. The what was that Mike Myers skit on SNL? Who was the character? Talk amongst yourselves. Who was that? That was
Yes, jumbo shrimp or neither jumbo nor shrimp. Talk among yourselves.
Go back and review that one sentence. There is no sane form of monetary policy per se.
Yeah. What do you think of that?
From the perspective of LaRouche and his writings here, it makes perfect sense, of course, but just take it as a sentence and let it sift through for a while.
Agreed.
I can remember going to an economics lecture in Melbourne. This would have been 1971 or two, somewhere around about there, in which we were, formal economic theory that said two things could never happen. They were mutually exclusive. One was rising unemployment and rising inflation. This was before you'd ever heard the word stagflation. Walking out of that lecture, going straight to the cafeteria, cup of coffee, newspaper in hand, front page news, unemployment at record levels, inflation at record levels. So everything that I just sat through for an hour, you walk in, you've got your coffee, whatever, pop, open the front page, and that whole lecture is just a complete waste of time.
Yeah, right up there with Mark Carney announcing how we have. He was celebrating the great work he did in 2009 when he was the governor of the Bank of Canada, saying that we've achieved a jobless recovery. What is this?
Oops.
Yeah, when your theories and reality don't mesh, what happens?
Yes,
well.
Programming.
Reality match with their goals, meaning to exploit people.
Well, that's the thing. That's the part that you're not supposed to say out loud.
Well, I think that money has a role in the economy, of course, because it's the intermediary factor between the different actors of the economy. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with that. And I would like to remind that it was under the Song Dynasty 1,000 years ago that the first paper money has been used for exchanges. And once again, rather than to carry 1,000 kilos of gold, it's much better to have a paper on which it's written 1,000 kilos of gold, and with the stamp of the government guaranteeing that the guy having that paper will get 1,000 kilos of gold. So that kind of thing, it's only an exchange feature. But if you want to use imaginary money to exploit people, there you have to invent some hocus pocus speech.
Well, Alan Greenspan just came to mind. I don't know why.
Oh, what a coincidence! Just remind us what he said.
Just the general impression of years of him as the Fed chairman. I can't even come up with them, but just think of something Groucho Marx would say, and you more or less are in the target zone.
Yeah, but he said something quite famous.
Oh, he said a few things. I think I can't remember them, unlike Bruce, but I'm sure that there are a number of quotable quotes from that man. He was still in charge of the Fed during the 2008 breakdown, wasn't he?
Ooh, Greenspan by then?
No, that was Bernanke by then.
Okay.
The controlled disintegration that was Paul Volcker, I think, if we're going back that far. And that was quite a phrase.
That was bold, eh? He just said
it.
Yeah, that was a lecture in a university in the UK, but I don't remember the name of the university. Okay.
And
That was the first time,
What?
The bumper sticker of irrational exuberance. I forget the context, but
Anyway, it wouldn't come back to be because Greenspan said something quite outstanding in relation with the exploitation of people, precisely.
What did he say?
It's in here somewhere.
It was something like, I don't know if it was related to gold, that gold is a fossil or something, a barbarian relic, so maybe that's one of the stuff, but there are many other things. But anyway, gold is a barbarian relic is something.
Yeah, no, he could spin words and spin, and just the idea of creative financial instruments, like the fact that he took something that was normally an activity you would go to jail for and spun it and turned it into, we're going to now engage in creative financial instruments, like a good thing. Like you're just gambling with junk bonds, like things that are necessarily designed to screw over the majority of people who play with them and enrich just a small clique of people in the know. That was the point of like how Michael Milken ran junk bonds, which got him into jail. And Greenspan just normalized that and made it part of like every single macroeconomics curriculum in every university in the West. It's insane. But all that to say, the thing that really struck me at the very end was because we're about to talk about investment tax credits, and I want people to hold in mind as well that in our weird, like, there's a reason why Alexander Hamilton is being promoted in on Broadway, as well as many high schools are seeing a popularization of Alexander Hamilton. I'm sure everyone's noticed this, right? Same thing for, oh, hold on, someone's calling. I'm so sorry. Sorry. Same thing for Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal is also being invoked, right? Through the terminology of the Green New Deal. So make no mistakes. The oligarchy knows exactly the sort of thing LaRouche is talking about regarding the continuous development of this anti-oligarchist modality of organizing a science of economy that's tied to creativity and the overcoming of the limits to growth, all the way from Plato through Colbert, Benjamin Franklin, Hamilton, Friedrich List, all the way up through uh, Franklin Roosevelt and JFK. They know this. And JFK really used the technique of, or the mechanisms of the investment tax credits quite a bit, as I think we're going to come to discover a little bit more. But they're inverting it. So they're taking a mechanical truth, and the oligarchy wants to utilize nations in order to be, for the nations themselves, to be instruments for the enslavement of people, to advance their ideals of what the oligarchy's objectives are regarding getting a society that obeys the limits, obeys the reduction of our powers of utilizing our creativity. So with, with this question of the investment tax credits that a proper economist should have, because like, how do you cultivate a desire for people to want to do certain things that might require more patience to receive payback for your investment, but it's going to be beneficial for the greater good of the system as a whole, of all of the people in the nation, right? Sometimes you might be able to make more money doing something that is destructive, but you don't want people to do something destructive, but you can't just go and force virtue, right? You can certainly illegalize, regulate vice, but you can't force virtue. So to cultivate uh, people's hearts towards doing things that are both good for themselves as well as the general welfare, that takes a little bit of time. And so the investment tax credit is one of many useful tools. Now, that's being done in some weird way in our current society in the form of things like subsidies to windmills and solar power plants all over the place. That's the reason why these things are even existing, because government taxpayer subsidies have infused tons of cash into these sorts of investment strategies that involve building photovoltaic cells or windmills that are intrinsically economically like insane. You would never want to do this sort of thing if you cared about your real if you cared about people, you wouldn't do this. So it's just that the effect of these is to contract the power of production, to contract the ability to actually produce the food, the agricultural goods needed, the capital goods needed to sustain life by design. That's the thing. But it doesn't mean that that technique is intrinsically bad. It's just that the intention is what's bad. That's utilizing this tool in a very bad orientation. So it's like, yeah, I just wanted to get that across because it is being done. And it's not Hamilton. When you see Hamilton on Broadway, that's not Hamilton. When you see Green New Deal, that's not Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. That's not what it was. These always just hold that in the back of your mind. These are the doppelgangers, the evil like the Bizarros for people who like DC Comics Superman. It's like there's this character Bizarro who is the opposite of Superman. Yeah, Susie.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So a thought that you brought to mind that I'm wondering is accurate when you started talking about the fact that Hamilton and FDR are being discussed more again. Is it kind of like they know that a major portion of the population is moving in this direction, and so they're trying to get out ahead of the wave and pervert it?
Yeah, I think I partially is that, and I think partially is that anytime you have central government planning you to do things, you have a lot of power. And the question then is, will you use that power for good or for bad? And the oligarchy being what they are, obviously want to use that power, but for their very uh, bad designs. The US has certain constitutional allowances and a historical precedent for utilizing central government to do things. And in the past, those things were in defense of the general welfare in opposition to the empire. Today, they want to sort of pervert and contaminate these instruments like national banking. They call them green victory bonds now. It's sort of like the same thing Franklin Roosevelt created with the victory bonds that were kind of like Hamiltonian, instruments or greenbacks that were used by Lincoln to build projects like the transcontinental. The oligarchy today they're pumping out all sorts of white papers and policies to promote a perverse version of these things. But yeah, I think you're partially
So
right, but there's a bit more to it.
we just need to be very careful to read the fine print.
Yeah,
Speaking of reading print with the goal of getting through this thing tonight,
yeah.
shall we?
Yes, please.
Could you make it a tick bigger, please, Matthew? Investment tax credits. It is in the vital interest of any national economy to prevent the takeover of its monetary financial system by what are known as financial bubbles. Any economy which is dominated by what is called today monetarism will create a form of financial economic cancer called a financial bubble. This was a tendency built into the US economy by the influence of Arthur Burns et al., a tendency which was greatly aggravated by the Nixon and Carter administrations and accelerated still more by such examples as Garnes, St. Germain, and Kemp Roth. The systematic feature of the present world economy, which distinguishes this present crisis as a breakdown crisis rather than a mere cyclical depression, is the fact that the cancerous influence of recent decades' monetarist fads have turned the world's monetary financial system into the worst, most bloated financial bubble in history. One among the most efficient instruments concocted for dealing with the threat of cancerous financial bubbles has been the graduated income tax. By imposing heavy tax rates on purely financial gains and giving relatively favorable tax treatment to useful investments in the physical capital of technological progress, we have a result which may appear to some to be a tax incentive, but is actually an anti-inflationary mechanism for regulating the flow of financial capital within the economy as a whole. The object is to steer the flow of physical capital formation and accumulation into categories which are most useful, and to drain off excessive flows of financial capital into the cancerous sinkholes of short to medium term financial speculation. Such taxation policies as these flow in design and purpose from the constitutional principle of the promotion of the general welfare. For a better insight into a prudent investment tax credit policy, look at some eligible classes of investments from the standpoint of the elementary principles of physical economy. On the condition that the relevant development of basic economic infrastructure is provided, investment programs oriented to increasingly energy-dense, capital-intensive modes express the embodiment of relatively advanced technologies into both the design of products and production processes. This has an effect as a secular tendency to lower the net physical cost of unit production while improving the product. Thus, it is the desire of prudent government to ensure that a share of the gain in productivity be returned to the investor, with the thought that this steering of the flow of income will tend to increase the concentration of capital formation in areas of activity which better serve the improvement of the general welfare. The use of the regulatory powers and power to tax by government is one way of steering the domestic flow of activities of the national economy into beneficial areas. The other measures are chiefly budgetary. The latter are typified by investments in three areas: A, hard infrastructure, such as mass transportation, large-scale water management and sanitation, and power generation and distribution. B, soft basic infrastructure, typified by educational and healthcare systems, and C, crash program types of science driver programs. These programs are sustained as government itself is sustained chiefly through general taxation at various levels of government. The system the United States had developed up to the middle of the 1960s is a fair approximation of a sound arrangement. A similar approach is applied to regulation of both domestic and foreign trade. The general object of sane government is the establishment and maintenance of what has been sometimes called a fair trade policy. A sane fair trade policy does not consider any price as sacrosanct. Rather, it is in the national interest that the nation maintain sufficient productive resources within its borders to withstand the equivalent of an extended siege. It is urgent that these resources be of a relatively competitive quality in product and productivity. This means that the quality of the labor force households must be maintained by fair household incomes and other means, and that the level of technological improvements be consistent with national economic security. Who would like to volunteer to keep reading?
You're a tough act to follow. I'll give it a try, but okay. I can't get to that level of expression with this monotone voice. This has nothing to do intrinsically with trade war or such matters. It is purely an internal matter of sane, orderly precautions taken in the interest of national economic security. We are wise to be as generous as possible in our dealings with other nations, but we must also be committed to the kinds of agreements on fair trade policies which foster their national economic security, as the same kinds of such measures benefit our own. Wages, policies, and related matters fall under the same heading as investment tax credit policy. The basic expression of national economic self-interest lies in the cycle of development of the young individual from birth through adult maturity, an interval of up to 25 years. The quality of life, education, and so forth afforded those households during that interval should be assessed as we should assess an investment tax credit policy. For example, this, contrary to the Nazi doctrine concerning lives not worthy to be lived, which persists in circles in several nations, including the USA, today, the care of the senior citizen is as essential to the general welfare as the care of the child and youth. The loss of the kind of social relations which used to be supplied by the extended family relationships among relatively stable families and communities has been savagely impaired over the course of the post-1945 decades, especially since 1971. The most important part of the development of the child and youth is the sense of cognitive aspects of cultural connections over a span of 1 to 2 centuries preceding. This sense of who I am now in respect to preceding and coming generations is not only an essential source of moral sense of social identity, but is essential to the development of the cognitive powers of the young individual. There is no short to medium-term price mechanism in a so-called free market setting, which could possibly converge symptomatically upon
Asymptotically.
asymptotic, okay.
Constantly converge without
It's a
ever
new one
quite
on me.
achieving you're aiming at.
Okay, asymptotically. Where did I go? Okay, upon a fair price. If it is said today that the price is right, we may be assured usually that that price is wrong from the standpoint of the general welfare of society. The points of illustration just supplied typify the way in which rational forms of intentions shape the way in which a money economy should work. By building such intentions into the structures of monetary, financial, budgetary, regulatory, taxation policies, and so on, society defines a set of parameters which will regulate the way in which the effects of pricing interact in the economy as a whole. These measures act as constraints, which have an effect akin to the role of universal physical principles in Riemannian views of a solar system. Such constraints do not determine the actual course of the economic process by themselves. Physical economic growth depends upon the insertion of cognitive innovations into this quasi-axiomatic framework that situates and defines those changes in the economic process on which net physical economic growth depends.
So we do want to finish this, so people should not get stressed, like I said. There will be a link to all of the previous readings that we made, but if there are any pressing questions or thoughts that people want to share or regarding some of what we just looked at, now we can do it before we go on to the theories of money.
I would. His observations of what a child needs to develop cognitively speaks to the red hot center of what I think is the biggest problem tormenting our society and our people is a sense of powerlessness due to the horrible is the only word I can come up with upbringing with children being sent to an institution as young as 4 years old, if not earlier, and not being able to develop for 20 some years, crawling all over their parents, getting in the way of the work, finally helping with the work, and then finally being able to do the work while the parents are now old and just sitting in the sunshine and sitting in the shade under a tree. That was an amazing, huge paragraph. I just screen copied it, and I can't wait to, further. I just, I put that on the table.
Yeah, important paragraph.
Well, further up. Oh, no. For example, this contrary to the Nazi doctrine, it was further down.
Yeah.
On the left. For example, the whole context of this part. And for him to, have that concern is not surprising given his understanding of everything else he's describing.
You were going to say, given his age.
Not at all. Nope.
No, I'm joking.
Nope.
Joking. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, it's yeah, that's just it, right? When you're valuing human beings not just for how much you can extract out of them, like today, if you look at Ezekiel Emanuel and his, how I wish to die when I'm 75 thesis, that's underlying his imposition of quality adjusted life years in Biden's health reforms that are trying to basically he has this entire utilitarian graph saying the people who should receive the most as far as receiving allocations of scarce medical resources in a time of economic crisis and scarcity are those who are maybe 20 to 30 who we've already invested a lot into them and now we can extract a lot out of them as their taxpayers and workers. But when you're a baby, you're a quality adjusted life year of a baby's life is very low compared to a 25-year-old. And it's about the same as like a 75-year-old who's, again, they're very expensive. There's, you know, they're not going to give much back to maintain the system. So that, you know, if you get a choice of a you know, kidney or some expensive medical procedure, and you only have enough medical procedure as they think about this to like give to a 25-year-old or a 75-year-old, give it to the 25 and let the 75-year-old get a death pill or the baby. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Why do we have this scarcity to begin with? Why do we have this? You know, nobody bothers asking that question, right? Like, why don't we have enough medical resources to go around? Is that even like something I should accept? Let alone your whole standard of judging what lives are worthy of being lived? That sounds a little Nazi. Like,
Well, and I hope you didn't. Maybe I want to make the point another way that I wanted to make was that the way children are raised by being taken from their families and put into schools obviates, you know, the development of this sense of who I am in respect to preceding and coming generations, et cetera. And it's also essential to their cognitive development. It's the tragedy of the loneliness, the alienation, and the despair of generations now in the West who were raised by school, and they don't have this experience of extended family time and the stories of, well, your grandfather did this and his grandfather did that and his grandfather did this, going back multiple generations, as he even says right here, in order for someone to be at home in their own skin and feel at home on the planet, at home in the universe, which is actually a great book title, a great book from a couple decades ago, At Home in the Universe, which was about a layperson's book of quantum physics. I will not go on, but I want to.
Well,
no, absolutely.
an interesting point of view, but what's to replace in our society teachers in a, you know, at that point in time, you know, how could you, what would be a solution?
Homeschooling.
I agree that the family, you know, the around the dinner table, you can get an education, assuming, you know, the right family. But and also the thing about older people, the participation with the younger, exchanging a point of view, and all that is an essential part of life, I think, you know, and everything is disjointed. I think that's where you're getting at, right?
Very disjointed.
Everything is compartmentized, and in some way it's not like a living structure.
And it's documented. The despair is quantifiable. The sadness, the drug alcohol addiction, the suicide attempts, and the rates. It's epic.
Yeah.
Look, it's a simple picture. What Bruce is drawing attention to. Most of us here, for example, have a fair experience of history, and probably through reading and interacting like this. But for the majority of people on the planet, their family is how they do interact with history, precisely because they get to interact with, you know, their siblings, etc., people their own age, then their parents and grandparents. And it's that connection to the past, you know, somewhat innate. I mean, you're born into it and everything like that. You can't escape it, but it is the first real connection that humans have to history, to the continuity of history and to their history, families, etc., etc. And Bruce is right, you know, I mean, it's been fractured considerably, really has.
Yeah.
And partly by technology as well, with the cell phone culture.
And TV before that. Moving on.
A lot of kids today, they're ashamed of their family's past. You know, dad's a drug addict, or
Yeah, and I mean there's so many layers upon layers of fallacy and disjointedness in the current system. It's just that out of whack with natural law and the way a healthy, integrated society should function. There's so many symptoms to it. It's wild.
so how do you fix it?
Well, let's just leave that as an open question. Let's not try to crystallize the answer, but that's a good question. Let's all have that hovering over our heads over this reading.
I liken, I brought up to my family this peer-to-peer community. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
this peer-to-peer communication or texting between a horizontal aspect of society rather than vertical is affecting our society very deeply. We don't know the results of that yet. It's new in the fact, and it's new in the last 10, 15 years, but children talk to each other more than they do to adults, teachers, or parents. And I think that is going to have a negative effect that we won't understand for maybe a decade or more.
Good point, John. I mean, the whole "don't trust anyone over 30" thing. That was that that might have started a little while ago, but that really set us on a wrong trajectory as far as an ethos. And now those who back in the '60s were chanting that are now feeling the bite, looking at their grandkids who don't respect them at all. Right, Sean, Bob, you want
You want
to
me
tackle theories
to
of money?
continue, or
Bob, you want to read?
oh, you want me to read? Okay.
You're doing good. Yeah.
I'll try. All right. Theories of money. The Anglo-American system is now gripped by the terminal stage of the greatest monetary financial collapse in history, the greatest systemic form of economic collapse in European history since the so-called New Dark Age. This present world crisis has several extremely relevant points of crucial similarities to that New Dark Age. Most crucial is the political, legal, moral issue. Who shall be paid, and who, on the contrary, shall be obliged to eat their own paper in the presently inevitable and long overdue process of monetary financial bankruptcy? Excuse me. If the financial creditors are supported in their claims, then the planet as a whole will now be plunged into genocidal, global physical economic collapse far worse than that of Europe's 14th century. In that case, the population of the planet could drop as much as 80% or more during the coming generation, while entire nations and cultures which still exist today will quickly disappear from the current scene, spawning thus additions in the list of humanity's extinct dead languages and nationalities. There is another leading similarity to the period from England's Henry II through Richard III, under whose sway Venice orchestrated not only horrible crusades and inquisitions, but kindred horrors in its efforts to establish and consolidate Venice's position as an imperial maritime form of financier oligarchical power. The thrust of the utopian Anglo-American faction behind the current waves of wars and imperial globalization is, as one historian has described it, today's distant mirror of the process which led to the 14th century New Dark Age. From that and related lessons of history, we should have learned already that when an overreaching financial power has brought on a bankruptcy such as the present global one, the relevant law which must be applied is the principle of natural law, known variously as the general welfare or common good. No buccaneers booty for the carpetbaggers or other predatory forms of financier interest could be tolerated. Financial claims have no intrinsic rights under such circumstances, except as society may recognize certain claims as morally privileged solely because of their usefulness to the present and future general welfare. Under any sane doctrine of law, a bankrupt must take responsibility for at least as much as were the consequences of his or her own willful folly. Specifically, whoever had the power to dictate the policies which led to ruin must assume the primary responsibility for the losses incurred by all. Thus, it was those financial and related oligarchical interests which imposed on nations the ultimate bankruptcy, which was inherent in the present system, which must accept and bear the relatively greatest portion of the burden of crisis. If the contrary policy were followed under conditions of today's crisis, a genocidal outcome worse than the 14th century New Dark Age would be inflicted upon all humanity. That later consequence cannot be permitted, and no argument can withstand the judgment of natural law. The proper general course of, the proper general course of action in all such cases is to create a new monetary financial system which works. Financial claims which perform a useful function for society under the old system should be honored in whole or part under the new. Payments of pensions, modest savings of individuals, and closely held enterprises, the relative modest capital of useful entrepreneurs, and so forth, are continued as the most convenient way of effecting the smoothest possible transition from the useless old form of monetary financial system to the new. The banking system is kept alive, even if bankrupt, because its continued existence as an institution of lending and deposit is in the vital interest of the nation and its community of nations. Bankrupt corporate entities continue to function, even in bankruptcy, if those continued functions are ones which are in the interest of the general welfare. In effect, in any monetary financial collapse on the scale and extent of the present global crisis, it will be necessary to create a new monetary system, eliminating the old. No alternative to that is tolerable. In many cases, existing currencies must be either replaced by new ones or extensively reorganized. Since the changes must be sudden ones, measures of reform must be as close to what has been proven to have been successful previously as possible. Therefore, the successful precedent of the 1945 to 1964 Bretton Woods post-war reconstruction model should be applied to the task of defining a global version of the multipolar system of kindred features among sovereign nation states that is simply the only visible choice of an equitable use of proven precedent available.
Yes.
For various reasons.
2001, just to say, 2001.
Pardon me?
Just reminding people who might be listening on YouTube, this was written
Oh, okay.
2001.
For various reasons, rather than attempt to replace the US dollar with a new currency, it were better to protect the dollar with protectionist regulatory measures. The measures required must include the establishment of a US national bank. The following scenario typifies the approach required for this reform. Since the Federal Reserve System is implicitly bankrupt, it is the constitutional obligation of the US government to take over the Federal Reserve System itself in receivership. This will place the system itself under the administration of the US Treasury. The plan will be to phase out Federal Reserve notes discreetly over time while creating a new instrument of federal credit for reconstruction-based recovery of the US economy. This will require a system of gold reserve denominated US Treasury dollars, whose leading function shall be to serve as an integral part of the mechanism of issuing medium to long-term credits at borrowing costs of between 1% and 2% annual simple interest. Lessons from Franklin Roosevelt's terms in office should be employed whenever suitable and feasible. The objective should be to bring the level of US physical and related output up to above physical economic break even, and also in terms of federal tax and other revenues over the medium term period. The credit issued should be focused on the combined objectives of short-term stabilization and medium to long-term growth. Once again, on this point, as on points argued here earlier, we must not lose sight of the reality that economic processes function in terms of the underlying influence of long-ranging cycles. Remedies for a crisis of the present type, for example, cannot be successful over a short term. Therefore, there will be no solution available for this crisis, which does not rely upon the creation of a state credit as a mechanism for bridging the gap between present bankruptcy and future break even. Through this mechanism, the following types of measures should be taken for reform of the US private banking system. All banks which have functions of deposit and credit, which are essential to continuation of orderly functioning of society, should continue to be used as instruments of delivery of payments due on pensions and scheduled release of savings, as well as new transactions under provisions for use of federal credit. The life of the ordinary citizen and community should continue with a minimum of disruption. Okay, I think I've reached much. My lips are beginning to stick together.
No, your reading is great, man. Thank you very much. Yeah, this is good. So yeah, pretty straightforward so far. This shouldn't be like rocket science. It's been done before under Hamilton to get out of the great, the bankruptcy that the US was in after the Revolutionary War. This was done by Franklin Roosevelt as well, putting the whole system through bankruptcy receivership. Requires a bit of a political fight, obviously, but it's been done. There's precedent, and it's being done right now when you actually look at the multipolar alliance today as far as the practices of credit issuance, loans at low interest rates for big, large-scale infrastructure, all of these things. It's there's a lot of precedents in the past and in the present to do this. It's not impossible.
When we go digital, which seems to be coming up real soon, do you think that will be global? They'll try to make it a global currency, and that is the Western global.
But you should read like Pepe Escobar's recent piece on the cradle, and look at Glazjev's conception of how a gold-based, commodities-based new system that might involve digital aspects to the currency operates under a completely different idea of value, purpose,
You
law
know, you know,
than we have with the Klaus Schwab Davos clique that have
yeah,
that work the same thing.
excuse me,
Yeah.
Matt, I read your piece on Glaziev, and I agree with all that.
Mm.
But my point is on the Western, when they're talking about real soon, because it looks like the economy is finally, and it's going into its final slide. And do you think that it's possible to have an international global currency? I'm talking about the neoliberals.
No, I don't think a world currency is feasible. It's going to be, computers allow you to have thousands of frequencies that you could easily separate and look at different values. But Thomas Edison, back in the early 1900s, before computers, said that the only honest currency could be an algorithm-driven currency. Take the people out of it. Now, you have an algorithm-driven currency on the market now, Bitcoin.
The Bitcoin, yeah.
It's criticized, but so far, humans have not been able to affect, except indirectly by purchasing it, the value of it. So, I don't see a central bank digital currency. That would be a morass.
But they want to control it, is what I'm getting at. And
Yes.
they want to control Bitcoin. Perhaps they couldn't control with the algorithms you're talking about. But if they want to control it, and they just want to get together with London and
you cannot allow them to do that. You do not want the people or the bankers in the control mechanism. That's why Thomas Edison said the only honest one would be an algorithm, because you take the human out of it.
well,
Yes, but I would like to.
wanting it though. Nobody wants. We know that those people up there have schemes, and they would like it that way.
Bob, I would like to introduce
I'm
a
just
very
curious.
down to earth.
Yeah, Quan, go for it. What do you have to say?
I would like to introduce very, very down to earth political reasoning. Okay, because we can go very far with all kind of mathematical or algorithmic consideration, but I think that the stake is not there. And I would like to go back a little bit to the fact that the present day banking system or neoliberal banking system is coming from a political system of oligarchy. Okay, because I would like to put that at the political level. If you look at all the countries where the ordinary citizen were granted a certain measure of comfort and freedom, were the country which in the last 3 centuries had a strong central government. Okay, like China before her decadence in the 19th century, like France under Conbert Louis XIV. Why do I say that? Because oligarchy is a natural thing. And when you have a primus inter pares as the first among equals, like in England, as the chief of the oligarchy, you would have problems because the people wouldn't be seen as sheep to be shorn by the oligarchy. And when you have a strong central government like China before her decadence in the 19th century, or China now because China is coming back, or like France under Louis XIV with his minister Conbert, you still have the natural oligarchy, because rich and powerful people naturally will come together. Okay, that's a natural stuff that you cannot prevent. So against that natural congregation of powerful and rich people, you need a strong central government to regulate them. And when you have that strong central government to regulate them, you would have a certain justice. And let's not forget that it's not only the question of uh, stupid balance. It's also only a question of epistemological development, and it's also a question of the right, loving intention of a true central government.
Here's the question, Quan, though, because I totally respect your wisdom, but the question is, how would this confluence of power brokers with wealth and affluence and capacity to do things with their power and wealth not then take control of those mechanisms of government and use it to their desires against the will of the people? Question, go.
That's why you need a central government offering an epistemological program to the general public, so that government will draw from the general public its servants. Okay, if you take the example of Louis XIV, he heightened the education of the French people at the moment, and most of the average people in the French administration were from humble origins, contrary to the high aristocracy. Okay, same in China under the imperial rule, when you have the meritocratic exams, allowing the emperor to take his servants from people of humble origins. So you will still have the great land. Well, if I take those historical examples, you had the great landlords who will be together naturally because of their birth, their power, and their wealth. Okay, and I'm not in favor of killing them. Okay, they have the right to exist. After all, oligarchs are human people too. So, but the idea is to prevent them to exploit the general public. Okay, and that is the role of a strong central government offering a good epistemological program, or in other words, a good classical education, in order to have servants of the state that are not from the oligarchy.
Well, the problem with that, Quan, is if you don't have God in the factor, you have a strong central government in the United States now doing that, but it's totally, utterly corrupt.
Exactly, but that's the problem.
And how do you remove that corruption is the key.
Okay, so I would say that okay, forgive me to take another Chinese example. Okay, because of my own background, I have biases. A great Chinese dynasty most of the time lasts 300 years. Okay, in the first 200 years, they managed to have a supervision system to track those oligarchical tendencies. Okay, because someone from a humble background at the first generation, well, 4 generations later, he will be part of the oligarchy. Okay,
Right.
so it's inevitable. So the only thing is that you have one solution that has been found, that the guy will be sent to rule in a province that is not his province of origin, and you have to limit the amount of land that the guy can have. Okay, because of the special historical development in China, which is different from the West. When the first emperor of China created the first Chinese empire in 221 BCE, he managed to reduce progressively the number of landowners who own enormous amount of lands. Okay, the equivalent of the oligarchs nowadays. So I'm not saying that there is a perfect solution, but in the case of China, as in the case of France, the quality of government has always been linked to the quality of the central government. And here, maybe I'm a little bit idealistic, but I think it's possible to create a so good educational program for the elite, plus the supervision and the anti-corruption ongoing supervision. It's possible to prolong the heydays before you get to the terminal phase, if you want. But it's it's something to be renewed at each generation.
Well, in history, this has been done properly. I agree. In China, in Greece, in time of Aristotle, they had procedures for, educating the people that would become the bureaucrats. But in our present situation, the corruption is so deep, and so there has to be a godly aspect of this. You look at medieval times or pre-medieval times in Europe, the emperor before 1300 had very little power to tax. Taxation never got above 10% of the GNP under these time. But then in about 1300, the power of the governments became such that they could raise taxes. They figured out how to do that, and the corruption then began. And I don't see an easy solution. I recognize, as you do, there are historical precedences, but they don't last but for a generation or two.
Wow. In the last, I would say, 150 to 200 years in China, I would say that I want to repeat what Benjamin Franklin said, okay? The best form of government is the true republic. But if you want a true republic, everyone will have to embark on a true epistemological journey, okay? So once again, I put on again my old cassette. You have to create as many aristocratic men as possible, okay? Man motivated by creativity, inventivity, etc., etc. And democratic man motivated by justice and honor. And so the root solution is the educational aspect.
To add one thing to that, John.
I agree with what you're saying. It's just how to do it.
That falls back to the question of that we're going to let those big questions hover over this reading today. We're not going to, but I am reminded just of one little quote by the figure of Lazare Carnot, who worked really hard to keep France alive during a very precarious moment in France's history under Napoleon, who made the point, even though because he himself was a republic, but he said, it's better to have Republicans without a republic than a republic without Republicans. I love that quote.
Yeah.
So, let that seep in.
Do you wish you had oligarchical powers, Matt, to try to get through this reading tonight?
Yeah.
But I don't.
But John, I would like to take 10 seconds, okay?
No,
about the situation in the US now. If I use Chinese lexicon, well, it's time for a change of dynasty, or for to use modern terminology. It's time for a regime change, but not in Beijing, not in Moscow, not in Tehran.
Epistemological regime change for all of those intelligence agencies who are listening into this conversation. Epistemological peaceful regime change entirely is what he's talking about. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, agreed.
I just want to say I don't agree. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Okay, but go on, Linda. I mean,
No,
say your bit, but then we're going to get back to the reading. So go ahead.
I'll read if you need a reader.
Love it if you could read, but do you want to say? I don't want you to suppress your feelings.
I think that that common people have common sense, and that's in terms of governing. And I don't know, as long as they're good people and not devious, like some of the people that are super rich are today, that I don't know how much education really matters. I think the American people have governed themselves pretty well. But, and I think that people who are super rich is the problem. How do they get super rich? How do you get kings? How do you get billionaires? And I think that's what we need to be focusing on, rather than on whether or not people are smart or stupid. I think, and I think, you know, the powers that they have to manipulate through their money and just their, like, their castle, the things that they own is more the problem.
Peter, you have a thought about that?
Pardon
We
me?
just
Yeah,
have
yeah,
to-
thanks, Matt, and good evening, and thanks for letting me in, albeit after the first hour. I do have a thought about that. I think that that education and addressing the culture is very important. I agree with Linda and her assessment of corruption arising as a result of concentration of wealth. I think that we got there through a succession of regressive taxation acts, most especially commencing with in 1981 and proceeding to the present. And then before that, the departure from the gold standard in 1971 just set the table for everything. As you can use that graphic of the beginning of the television show Mission Impossible. 1971 was the place where the hand lit the match and then touched the fuse. But I see a real need to educate, and most especially for people to understand what is oppressing them and why, and what we can do about it. And I think that reference to classical education and
Yes.
an idea of natural law in harmony with the creator, as people understand the creator, is really the founding light for the nation, and really started us off in the right foot. And if I were to draw an analogy in terms, I see a real connection between the term natural law and a term that Confucius used, mandate of heaven. And I'd ask Quan Li if that's a good analogy or if it misses someplace. But
It's
for the time.
a perfect analogy.
Susie, did you want to?
I just wanted to pop
quick
in and
item
say that
before we keep on going.
I just wanted to say, when we talk about education, we need to remember that the type of study that we're doing, even in these readings, when Quan Li is talking about education and Peter mentioned classical education, we are talking about the development of the entire person, the growth of the entire person, not the fragmented education that we've been receiving in our culture,
That's
but
a great
full
point.
development of the person and all the things that you say about conscience and creativity.
Yeah, that's an important part, that important point, Susie. That was really hard to say. That we didn't really get education. Oh, we lost our friend. Okay. All right, but yeah, we didn't really. Oh no, Linda. Yeah, we didn't really get an education. You or I or any of us. We were really deprived of what we had an inalienable right to receive, which was an integrated, real education that was presented, that should have been presented the way it was by Ben Franklin to the American people early on before the Revolution, and then by Plato in the academies and by Confucius to his students, which is about the development of the soul. And the problem is we've been living under this system of oligarchism for a long time, which has been keeping education misdefined around memorizing, repeating, getting good grades. So we have we're kind of like speaking without the full experience of having had a real education, the type of which LaRouche is talking about, or I think Quan was inferring regarding the idea of like a society ruled by the best people. It really should, I think, need that all people should be given the opportunities to become the best that they could be. So anybody could feasibly, ever more perfectly, become a leader if they're called upon or if the opportunity is presented, rather than just having, an inborn hereditary elite who have the property, who have their ill-begotten gains, right, that they use as justification to rule over their slaves. Very different philosophy of rulership and of leadership.
Yeah, I just want to say something in relation of what John said. Okay, China tried it for 12 times. It failed 12 times, and the Red Dynasty now is the 13th attempt. So I just want to say that it's a very long process, and you don't have to, how can I say it? We have to be patient, and we have to give classical education a chance, because we will not get to the perfect society like that in a snap. Okay, after all, even if you come from ancient Egypt, our history is only 5,000 years old. Okay, it's not so long.
But may I just say one thing?
Yeah, Rich.
Go ahead.
Just I was a teacher, and I went through the the theory classes and all the rest of that. And I just want to say that the universities, at least my experience was, that they taught that to teach the whole child. All right. But when you get into the classroom, and because of the people, like, I just hate to just refer to him all the time, but Bill Gates basically decided what we would teach. So I think you need to tackle the problem of how we get these billionaires. Okay, and it's just like, how did we get kings, and why do we have them?
Linda.
Okay, are you in favor of the solution of the French Revolution, to use the guillotine?
I have some other ideas. I think that's a little barbaric.
Okay, no, but I'm very serious. I'm very serious,
I'm
because
serious too.
the French tried the violent solution, and they went back to oligarchy just 2 generations after.
Well,
I don't know my history well enough to combat that, but I don't think that's exactly true.
the longest republic, the longest living republic was Carthage, 500 years. And in Carthage, they had a constitutional procedure where if a family tried to take over the government and they were guilty of that, the entire family and all of the relatives would have all of their assets taken from them, and they were to be put out into the desert for 10 years and live off of nothing out there. If they survived after 10 years, they could come back in and get their wealth back.
Wow.
Maybe we should try that.
Well, John, I didn't know that Carthage had the same system than China, but there is no desert in China. They were exiled.
Yes, and sadly, Carthage came to a sad end.
Well, maybe it's because they were not as ruthless as the Roman oligarchs.
Just changes in history, or not as powerful as the Roman oligarch at that time.
Yeah, but anyway, I would stop after that. I want to say that we have to be patient, okay? Because we cannot get the perfect government just after 5,000 years.
Good point. Think about the long game here, guys. All right, let's do this. City of God time. So, international measures needed, 2001. What do we got to do? Okay, we lost Bob. Peter, you want to read?
Okay. One of the unavoidable major features of any feasible recovery from the present systemic breakdown crisis will be a sharp reversal of the recent decades trend toward globalized forms of free trade. The U.S. economy provides adequate illustration of this general point. Since the past 30-odd years of ongoing systemic destruction of the U.S. physical economy by radically monetarist measures, the USA, like the centuries-old British Empire, has maintained its power through increasing dependency on what are sometimes termed euphemistically invisible earnings. The United States has, in effect, become a parasite, subsisting on such forms of tribute as its growing current accounts deficit on import-export transactions and its forceful collection of vast monetary financial influxes into highly speculative U.S. financial markets. Through Anglo-American financier interests' control over the International Monetary Fund, the international monetary financial system was rigged to such effect. The aggregation of financial power so organized enabled the United States to subsist physically and to posture as the world's greatest success, which it was not, by increasing reliance on imports of relatively cheap goods from dependent nations of the world, thus filling the gap caused by the willful collapse within the agricultural and industrial sectors of the internal US economy. Try to find a Russian-produced good in a store in Moscow today, or with some relatively greater likelihood of success, a good actually produced in the USA being sold in the US shopping mall. Thus, the evidence plainly available to any US household visiting a US shopping mall has been that the United States has been surviving as a nation through its role as an importer of last resort. The United States loots its national income as virtually tribute from abroad, and then spends some of that income to buy the cheap goods to replace what used to be produced by the US labor force. Thus, the United States became the market on which producing foreign nations depended for their financial income. So the United States became the lender of last resort and is now on the verge of becoming the world's bankrupt of last resort. That is to emphasize that over a year ago, the USA's position as the importer of last resort came near its end. Nations which depended upon this artificial temporary US role as a market for cheap labor and related goods are now suffering an accelerating collapse in their ability to balance their domestic budgets through exports. This involves both long-term and recent cyclical trends, both of which bear on showing the urgency of reversing the recent decades' trends in free trade and globalization policies. The immediate cause for this recent trend is shown by studying the US and world economies from the standpoint of my 1995 triple curve imagery, figure 1A. Official statistics of governments, monetary agencies, and private groups are highly unreliable, but allowing for the wide margin of outright fraud and wild error, which are demonstrated to be typical of such reporting over the recent 2 decades, it is clear that during the recent 2 years, a critical crossover point was reached in the behavior of data as reflected in triple curve accounting. The United States reached a point at which the amount of monetary output needed to sustain the nominal trading value of marketed financial assets had increased to the point that the monetary input exceeded the financial rollover effected, figure 1B.
Yeah, so we've already looked at this. Nobody should be unfamiliar in some way with these two curves, but that's basically what he was just describing. It's an overly simplified but very principally truthful expression of why this systemic breakdown has the character that it has and how he was able to foresee this, even going back to his writings in the 1970s. He was talking just this way because this curve starts around the early 1970s when the dollar is detached from the gold reserve fixed exchange rate system of Bretton Woods. And that's around the time that you have the detachment of the concepts of monetary investments, the behavior of pricing of other monetary instruments that was detached and severed from the physical economy, which had they were formally tied together. And as soon as we allowed people to think of these as two different universes, the physical reality, the infrastructure, the quality of healthcare, everything else that we live in, that was allowed to deteriorate as people became super focused on monetary returns, shareholder value, speculative instruments that were tied to whatever the markets decide at any given moment. And as we could hear from Klaus Schwab and other peoples from the economic the Davos crowd, that was always designed to blow. It was never designed to be a forever thing. They created a time bomb by creating what was obviously going to be bubble after bubble sitting upon unpayable rates of debt with an atrophying physical economy. That was always understood to be something that will blow and be detonated. The question just was simply when and how. And what he's got here on the right side is the 2001 moment, because the first image is from like 1995 that he unveiled this, and the second one is from 2001 when derivatives were deregulated, over-the-counter derivatives specifically, and we had the increasing of the monetary aggregates, which anyway, basically things got out of hand, even more on a hyperbolic level. So yeah, when we're thinking about reorganizing the system, when anybody who is in that position whether Glaziev, I'm sure, will be involved in this discussion. Many other nations, many other economists will be involved at that point of crisis. These are the considerations that they have to have in mind, and they are having in mind as they're thinking about, putting the system through receivership. What do you save? What do you not? What is unsavable? So just keep that in mind as far as the triple curve is concerned.
In a real economy, physical economic stability and growth depend upon the generation of an adequate margin of new physical capital inputs from the existing production and circulation of goods. Under conditions of imposed free trade, the margin of actually net capital formation becomes negative as a result of driving forces down to levels at which true national economic costs of production are not met. So-called fiscal austerity measures intended to bring financial accounts into balance through looting physical capital and human bodies alike define the causes for the systemically cyclical downward curve for real output in the triple curve imagery. Therefore, to restore any of the relevant national economies and the world economy as a whole back towards physical economic break-even levels will require a reversal of free trade measures generally, and also an utter obliteration of so-called globalization policies. If those changes are not made, no recovery from the present system collapse were possible. This means the
There's a
reinstallation.
little picture for those listening and not watching. There's a picture of Frederick List with the caption saying he was the great German economist of the American system of political economy and the Friedrich List Society of the early 1930s. Germany, headed by Dr. Wilhelm Lautenbach, developed the policy by which, had it been adopted, Hitler's takeover would have stopped. Important little point of history there.
I think it would have stopped if the Rathenau Treaty of 1922 at Rapallo had lived rather than died with his assassination.
Yeah, well, Kurt von Schleicher was and Walter Rathenau were both members of the Friedrich List Society, and Kurt von Schleicher was Rathenau's assistant at Rapallo in 22, and he's the guy who became chancellor, who was about to put the Lautenbach plan into motion. So it's all part of the same thing. Hitler
Thanks
wouldn't
for
have been
connecting
possible.
those dots, Matt. I did not know that von Schleicher connection.
Yeah.
This means the reinstallation of the kinds of protectionist policies characteristic of the American system of political economy. The included objects are to renationalize production while building in a margin of net capital formation into the production by national economies as entireties. The possibility of a systemic recovery depends on generating that margin of capital formation through production of chiefly physical goods. This margin of capital formation provides, in turn, the included basis for state creation of the fiat credit needed to finance the economic recovery. I reference once again the report of Dr. Wilhelm Lautenbach to a 1931 secret meeting of the Friedrich List Society, as I have in some earlier locations. The use of methods of fiscal austerity to manage an economy and economic depression is sheer lunacy. Fiscal austerity has the effect of idling productive resources, such as large portions of the labor force and productive capacity. In other words, fiscal austerity under economically depressed conditions destroys the very productive potentials by means of which the depression could be reversed. In any economic depression, the function of a sane and moral government is to provide the circumstances and stimulus under which idle productive potential is put to useful work. The mechanism for doing that is the directed use of state credit. Had the Lautenbach report been adopted as Germany's policy in 1931, Adolf Hitler would have never come to power in Germany. Applying the lessons of the Franklin Roosevelt recovery and also the related lessons of the essential role of protectionism in permitting successful relations among the Americas, Europe, and Japan during the 1945-1964 interval provide a proof of principle argument to be used for the basis of defining an equitable multipolar system of international monetary and related cooperation now. This will require the architecture of a gold reserve system comparable to that of the 1950s. It is important, of course, that there be no confusion between the useful notion of a gold reserve standard and the inevitable pernicious effects of a gold standard like that used by London prior to changes introduced by Franklin Roosevelt. This could be premised on the US dollar, but also could be established as a fresh way of assessing the lesson from such examples as the IMF special drawing rights conception of the 1970s. If special drawing rights in a drastically reorganized international monetary system were denominated as a gold reserve unit, that system could work successfully on the condition that certain other measures were included as an integral part of the agreements. Consider two classes of such agreements: a general agreement on trade and credit, and the need for a matching technology driver for the world economy as a whole. The paradigm for the first of these needed arguments could be usefully identified as the intention to establish a Hamiltonian form of international cooperation among sovereign nation states. The second is represented by special projects. The two typical special projects to be used for illustration here are what my associates and I have identified as a Eurasian land bridge cooperation and international cooperation in nation-based science driver crash programs, including space programs. There are two kinds of physical sports. One is based on competition among players or teams of players. The other are sports in which the individual or a team challenges itself and challenges others to challenge themselves similarly. It is the second model which should define the relationship among sovereign nation states, each cooperating in the quest to discover better ways by which each can better itself. The point is to bring humanity, at least, out of the jungle and into a civilized form of cooperation, rather than football field or Nintendo game styles of competition in the cause of improving national life. From that standpoint, the present tasks of the community of sovereign nations can be summed up as the complementarity of the efforts to improve mankind's mastery of the challenges of both inner and outer space. Take the case of Africa as an example. I gotta sign out here, Matt. So
Right. Thank you so much for the reading. It was great. Who wants to do Help Africa?
I'll take us home if you like, Matt.
Please do, Paul.
Help Africa. The essence of the greatest political and social issue is that if oligarchs can succeed in bringing about acceptance of the notion that one section of humanity as a whole can be treated as hunted and herded animals are, no part of humanity can claim under law to be free from the same treatment a hunter or herder affords to the creatures upon which he preys. Thus, the unfinished issue of Africa becomes the pivotal moral and economic expression of that question, on whose solution the welfare of all humanity depends. Therefore, whereas the cooperation of Western Europe and Russia with China, India, and others in bringing Eurasia up to a required level is the most crucial mission now challenging humanity as a whole, success in Eurasia were not likely to be durable unless modern European civilization's brutish injustice to Africa, including slaves extracted from Africa for exploitation in the Americas, were also remedied in a decisive way. The combination of the obvious, comparable development objectives for Eurasia and the Americas sets a standard long-term objective for the coming generations of humanity as a whole. Winning that objective requires that the case of Africa be addressed in an exemplary fashion. Reciprocally, what we demonstrate our principle to be in our approach to the matters of Africa will be both a test of and a model for our thinking about the present and future conditions of humanity as a whole. The international community's special responsibility toward the African continent is to provide the margins of assistance needed to ensure that the large-scale basic economic infrastructural requirements of the continent are put into place through cooperation with the responsible governments of Africa itself. This assistance should recognise the long-term potentials of the continent in respect of the present and future need for Africa's sovereign development of that concentration of mineral and other biosphere resources it contains. Look at Africa as an expression of the noosphere and prepare to develop its biosphere accordingly. The relevant projects on which the international community should be focused for this purpose are, First, the category of large-scale development of transportation, water management and sanitation, energy production and distribution, and urban systems. Secondly, the development of public health and educational system as systems. These efforts include long-range intentions for the development of the Sahara as a region of economic progress and habitation. This done chiefly through the deployment of large-scale basic economic infrastructural systems as an extension of the infrastructural development of the African continent as a whole. Thinking about Africa in such directions becomes significant after the victory of the USA over the Confederacy in the 1861 to 1865 Civil War. The conception of rail transport from Cape Town to Cairo, although a British imperial conceit, nonetheless reflected the existence of a natural axis of development up the Nile rather, through the Great Lakes region and down to the tip of Africa. The French project, prior to Fashoda, 1898, for a sub-Sahara route of rail transport from Dakar to Djibouti is another example. There are numerous other specific large-scale examples, many of which I have addressed in published collaboration with others over the period since 1975. And of course, there's what's happening today.
Mhm.
My emphasis has been and remains that rather than thinking of rail connections as such, we must recognise that, as in the best features of the USA's development of its transcontinental railway system, a main trunk land transport line must define transport as merely one essential component of a development corridor in which water management, energy generation and distribution, and nodal urban systems are integral requirements. What the Americas and Eurasia should undertake as the area of their leading joint responsibility is to provide Africa the assistance by aid of which relatively impoverished Africa can have rapidly in place the network of development corridors on which the effective development of the economies of Africa depends absolutely. By supplementing the mobilization of such development corridors with general systems of public health and education, a full set kernel of essential infrastructure is made available. Apart from the need for large-scale assistance in creating such a network of development corridors, the point to be stressed is that this development must be an assisted development by Africans themselves, rather than as cargo dumped upon their land areas. Creation of teams, akin to the teams with Egypt was developing prior to a shutdown by foreign powers, of an effort of this type within Egypt and Sudan, is a good example of the approach which would succeed. What must be envisaged is a phased technology transfer, in the course of which an increasing percentile of the development operations are taken over and run by recruits from the population in the vicinity of the project's development. The point of that emphasis is to foster the development of an appropriate labour force, which will serve as a growing cadre force for the broad-based economic development of the area, its economy and population as a whole. For example, Africa, under conditions of development, has all the natural potential for an agricultural revolution oriented to the growing markets in Asia. The use of infrastructure programs to address the critical bottlenecks for agriculture development, if combined with rational forms of urban development, provides the potential for the targeted objective of broad-based development of full-set African national economies. In such economies, the mineral potential of Africa, rather than being exported as a mere colony's exports, must be a processed resource from which the semi-finished and finished products of the economy are produced for both domestic and foreign use. Such international cooperation in support of the internal self-development of Africa should be considered a complement to the exploration of solar space. This means science and technology pioneering with the same quality of developed means in outer and inner space. The land bridge as a syndrome. I have emphasized the following point repeatedly in earlier locations, so it will be sufficient to summarize the relevant argument here, but it must be summarized in this immediate context. At the present time, Western continental Europe, to say nothing of the United Kingdom, is implicitly bankrupt. Under presently prevailing conditions, hopelessly so, and even more so 20 years on since this writing. The only available hope for overcoming that condition is the opening It's a nice map
Look at that.
of large-scale markets for European machine tool grade and related technology in Russia in particular, and Asia in general. Only by bringing the level of the machine tool grade and kindred exports from Germany and other European nations up above the threshold of a national physical economic break-even level can Western Europe survive in the form it has recently existed until now.
Just quick.
All conditions are
Let's just look quickly at that map, which is the quick overview of. Here, let me just make it smaller, because we have now just a map for anybody listening and not reading along visually of the Transaqua project, which is a massive canal proposed in the late 1970s by an Italian firm and rekindled just a few years ago by a team of Chinese and African and also Italian companies to take some of the southern water, wastewater from the Congo River Basin in the south of Congo and move it up through a series of 2,000 kilometers of canals into the north through Chad to replenish Lake Chad and build up something like 70 gigawatts of electricity along the way and different industrial corridors and everything else. So this is all just one map quickly summarizing what this thing is. And Larry Freeman is a leading representative of the Lake Chad Basin Commission himself. He's been to Chad, he's been to Congo dozens of times, promoting this thing for like 20 years. So just keep that in mind next time you listen to Larry Freeman giving an RTF lecture.
looking at the inset there at the bottom too, you'll notice just how big in terms of the overall size of the continent of Africa, that white portion there is a very large percentage, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, that's a big project.
That's the basin, yeah.
Yeah, potentially a very big project.
But basically what he was saying back a couple of sentences ago about not only bringing in the resources, but also training the locals to work on the projects. That is exactly what you're talking about that the Chinese are doing with the Belt and Road Initiative, right?
That's exactly what they're doing. Exactly. Yes. Yeah. You got it.
Okay, continuing on, I'll start again from that sentence. 4 conditions are required for this reversal of a presently onrushing catastrophe. First, a new international monetary system, as I have specified, must be summarily adopted and set into motion. Second, Europe must revert to a system of perfectly sovereign nation states, each with the authority to create state credit. This does not require reversal of the customs union aspects of recent trends of unification of the economies, provided the sovereignty of the nation over its currency, banking, and credit are fully re-established. Third, Western Europe must become a partner in the economic and mutual security aspects of a growing tendency toward large-scale cooperation among Russia, China, India, and other states of Asia. Hopefully, the USA will become a contributing participant in such arrangement. Yeah. Fourth, there must be mechanisms established for long-ranging credit at simple interest rates, not in excess of 1% to 2% per year, respecting long-term development and trade investment agreements among the sovereign national member states of this area. The intent of such reforms must be to establish a long-term process of development based on outflows of machine tool grade and related technology from areas of high potential into regions which suffer a current deficit in this capability. The leading emphasis must be on basic economic infrastructure, especially development corridor development, and accelerating the rate of development of agricultural and manufacturing productivity and output under the stimulus provided as a byproduct of large-scale infrastructural development. Adopt similar approaches to re-establishing healthy forms of sovereign nation-state economies throughout the Americas. Agreements among states of the Americas, which are modeled on the legacy of the kind of American system of political economy implicitly defined by Alexander Hamilton's famous report to the US Congress, would be the optimal basis for the relevant agreements. D, in summary, avoiding the tragedy. The United States in particular is teetering at the brink of a classically tragic end to its existence. Contrary to the romantic mythology of the English and German literature courses, a classical tragedy is never caused by the wrong imposed upon a people by its leader. It is caused by the leader's failure to override the tragic folly of the people themselves. Recently, for example, the Democratic Party was led to an electoral catastrophe by its selection of Vice President Al Gore, just as the United States today hovers at the brink under President George Bush. As in great classical dramas, the threat of doom lies not in either of the two candidates, but in the selection of such candidates by the political parties and public opinion which caused inadequate leadership to be selected. The fault in all cases of true tragedy lies in the people themselves, in the popular culture, in the generally accepted assumptions of the majority of those people. I would put in a little addendum there, including how they were led to those assumptions. In US politics today, a tragic quality of prevalent personal immorality is frequently expressed by the slogan, "Go along to get along," or by statements to the same effect, such as the silly and technically absurd, "You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube." The problem lies with what the Romans call vox populi, or popular opinion, as the same thing is called today. The billionaire-owned mass entertainment and news media dictate the opinions which the people learn, and the people are controlled by what they then insist is their own opinion. Such is democracy in the United States today. People democratically saying what they are afraid to be overheard not saying. In just that way, the majority of the US population was brainwashed into abandoning national economic policies of the Franklin Roosevelt legacy, which had worked in favor of the past 30 years' opinion, which have led this nation into the present global economic disaster. Nearly every once relatively successful culture in known history died in a similar way. There have been, naturally, a few happy exceptions. I think Kwan would agree with that one. In classical studies of this problem, as the problem is presented in the greatest classical stage tragedies of European culture since ancient Greece, it is recognized that there is but one type of remedy for the tragic follies of customary popular opinion. The remedy for tragedy is known in those quarters as the sublime. By sublime, one means to rise above the mediocrity of popular opinion and to see the relationship of the present spot to what should be recognized on the horizon. Escape from tragedy begins when a people ceases to say, "We have been betrayed," and to ask one another instead, "How have we failed?" To induce you to act to save yourselves, I must induce you to recognize how and why your own habituated present beliefs and conditioned knee-jerk reactions misled you into this sucking swamp which grips our nation today. To that purpose, I have been obliged to address a number of points about history and culture, but above all, I have concentrated in pointing out to you how a real economy actually works, and which presently generally accepted beliefs about economy would cause us to destroy our own civilization. I have spoken to you as all important leaders of civilization have spoken to their people in times of crisis comparable to this one. May you be blessed with the wisdom to have heard my counsel. Thanks for listening.
Excellent conclusion.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that took a while, but we finally got there.
Got there.
Wow.
It's this question of, I think, yes, humility. There's a certain arrogance that that's tied to tragedy, and I think it's only when we can discover humility that we can correct our erroneous thoughts and passions and assumptions. And sometimes that requires that we feel a bit of pain for having thought the wrong way for a little bit too long, and now all of a sudden realize, shit, this hurts. I have to think about how I was thinking wrongly that got me into this fire. But a lot of people would rather just hold on to their illusions as they sink with the Titanic. That's also a problem. Which is going to win out, humility or pride?
I just want to stress 3 lines, okay?
Mhm.
But I think you all saw that. A classical tragedy is never caused by the wrong imposed upon a people by its leader. It is caused by the leader's failure to override the tragic folly of the people themselves.
Hmm.
Okay. And once again, it reminds me what Professor Chiang Weiwei of Fudan University said. If you let the Chinese people rule China instead of a meritocratic leadership, you wouldn't have China attacking Japan, maybe with nukes, and causing havoc in the region and in the world. Okay, because most of the what I call the democratic Chinese people, meaning a democratic man, once again, according to Plato, is someone motivated by tribal affinities, hedonisms, and sense of perception. If you let the majority of the democratic Chinese people rule China now, they would try to nuke Japan, wreak havoc in East Asia, and causing plenty of problem in the world, rather than to be a stabilizing factor, because China is ruled now by a meritocratic leadership rather than by the mass of the democratic Chinese people. And that is exactly what LaRouche means. It is the tragedy is caused by the leaders' failure to override the tragic folly of the people themselves. So the leaders have to be leaders. My old fantasy is that one day when we will be at the top of our human evolution, we will reach to anarchy. Okay, anarchy means absence of leadership. But for anarchy to be a reality, all of us would have to be aristocratic men.
Yeah.
Which is akin to saying the same thing about the republic. Will only work if everybody within the public strives to, to function as decent citizens.
But I still struggle with the idea that, actually all of us are responsible for getting ourselves here, and it wasn't done to us, because we have had some really good character among us, and some really good character being taught. But the ones that grow into visible leadership on a national scale constantly are assassinated by these idiots. So we're each responsible for becoming all that we can be to build a better world. But there's a problem there that does need to be addressed, like Linda was saying. And no, I don't want the guillotine, but they do need to be stripped of their ill-gotten gains and made to go out and do some real work for a change.
That would be an incredibly perfect punishment for most of these creeps who have never learned an honest, normal, healthy skill in their life or did a minute of honest labor, is to force them into trade schools and to do work. That's like that they would probably rather die than be forced to work honest jobs.
Well, Matthew, precisely. It would be such a loss of faith for them that they would have preferred to commit suicide.
We should supply them the means if they so choose.
Give them that option.
Yeah. They can do seppuku if they want to.
Canada has the mechanisms in place these days for that to be a operation.
Paul, are you suggesting something, Paul?
Voluntaristic, voluntary made for oligarchs.
Needless to say, I'm being facetious, but yes, it does tie in. I mean, the events in Canada in relation to euthanasia at the moment are quite horrific.
I like this idea, like that he specified this question here in this part I'm highlighting. The problem lies with what the Romans called vox populi, or popular opinion. The billionaire-owned mass entertainment and news media dictate the opinions which the people learn, and the people are controlled by what they then insist is their own opinion. Such is democracy in the United States today. People democratically saying what they are afraid to be overheard not saying. And I think, like, if you have like a real republic, which the U.S. was as Ben Franklin even specified very clearly, it is a democratic republic. It's not a democracy per se, it's a republic. But if you have that type of actual democratic republic, then every individual is morally inoculating themselves to becoming those sorts of people he's describing there. Because you're people who can think for yourself, and you won't just be persuaded to take on opinions that you didn't generate from inside your own mind and think that it's yours. You won't be able to be deceived that way. Whereas the people who've never made internal generated like thoughts that they created themselves through work and rigor, if they've never had those experiences and they just are used to the other kind of thinking, which is more like, memorizing what experts want me to say or think, then they'll always be inclined to adapt to whatever the oligarchical levers want the mass convictions to be, and think it came from themselves, and they'll fight over it with pitchforks. And
Hmm.
yeah, I remember the what is it what's that movie, oh God, Atticus, the little girl Atticus, played by God.
Kill a Mockingbird.
Yeah, To Kill a Mockingbird. Yeah, remember at one point you got that whole like raving town of like I think the sorts of people LaRouche is sort of thinking about here, right? But the mob comes to the door to basically do a lynching of this black guy who's being falsely blamed for having done a crime, a murder, or a rape it was. And Atticus has to like talk them down as like a true leader coming from a higher place and not go along with the mob and be popular. He had to really like risk a lot to go against it. But that was like a certain exhibition of what everyone should be trying to do as far as expecting their leader not to just like flatter them or to be popular, but to even say what the mob does not want to hear, because the mob is has been deluded.
Hmm.
Yes, talking cows.
On that map, there's a book, Engineer's Dreams, and one of the dreams was to, and I don't know the name of the river, might be the Congo River, that empties into the Atlantic. And right before it empties into the Atlantic, it goes through a narrow passageway where the waters are like 1,000 foot deep. It narrows down from miles wide to just 1,000 feet. And they say if you dam that river there, which is feasible to do, it would back a huge lake up into the Congo and into Chad. And it would form a freshwater lake like the United States Great Lakes right in this Chad region. And then water would flow north into the Mediterranean Sea, and it would create, over time, the Mediterranean Sea would be a freshwater sea.
Whoa.
Wow.
That might upset a few fish.
Yep.
Definitely need a different idea of what the biosphere and noosphere are for that not to freak out a lot of eco-environmentalists. But yeah, no, that there's all sorts of these amazing, brilliant ideas that have been sabotaged over the last few centuries that really could have just eliminated hunger as we know it off the face of the earth. There's no
Yes.
reason why a lot of these things should not have been done already.
And that, remember that Libya presentation I sent to you on Gaddafi was in the process of creating a garden state of Libya in North Africa.
Yeah. Great
And
men.
we
but,
eliminated him.
yes.
Yeah, what happened to him was, from my perspective anyway, just absolutely brutal.
Oh, yes. And
Just
it was all because he was challenging the United States and England and the monetary system.
the gold dinar and all of that sort of thing. I mean, there were a multiplicity of reasons, but the way it all happened, I mean, how the world could just sit back and accept it.
Yeah.
Well,
I,
because because they are afraid. Because they are afraid. I would say that Gaddafi was a noble man, but he was not patient enough. He should have coordinated with Russia and China and Iran for his project.
Well,
And
I don't,
here, sorry, go.
I don't think he did anything wrong. You know, his timing was not within his control. But
Yeah, he was just
but the truth is that there's not been an honest election in the world in the last 50 years. It's all been manipulated and controlled. So, you know, look at our 2022 election. It's a morass. We know it. What can you do about it? Where's the button to press? You know, look at Arizona. You know, we have not, the United States has not had an honest election in 50 years. We don't know what the people think.
Well, precisely. I want to be a little bit provocative here, John. The election system has probably been established by the oligarchy because it's the best way to manipulate the democratic man. Okay, democratic man, once again, according to the Platonic definition. Okay, the fact that, okay, from a neurobiological perspective, the brain at 18 years old is not the same brain at 21 years old. Okay, the fact that the right to vote has been granted to people aged 18 years old, for me, is an oligarchical maneuver granting that power to people having an immature brain. Okay, and that's one example among many. And speaking of Vox Populi, there's an excellent book by a Frenchman called Lucien Cerise. The title is Neuropiratage. If you want to make the effort to read that book in English, in French, it is truly a deep neuropsychological study about how you can manipulate people with mass media, with a effect education. Because let's not forget that I think that all of you know the theory by Antonio Gramsci, the theory of cultural hegemony. If you manage to dumb down the general population, you don't need to do much on the political level because you can get the vote that you want. And there is a French nobleman, I forgot his name, Alexis de Tocqueville. In the 19th century, he wrote a book, Democracy in America. Okay, he wanted to reassure his fellow noblemen that they don't need to fear democracy, electoral democracy, because it's possible to manipulate people to vote in the direction of that the powerful and the wealthy want them to vote.
Well, Quan, I agree 100% with what you're saying, but the system is so jerry-rigged in the machines and the software that they don't need, I mean, they are doing what you're saying, but they will create 50 million votes if they have to, you know, and we accept that. We should be out on the street demonstrating against these procedures. We know they're happening.
Well, John, I would be very cynical. As long as there is heating, enough food, and enough entertainment, nothing would happen. Okay, because I'm not saying that to offend people. Okay, most Chinese people are democratic people. Most American people are democratic people. Most Canadian people are democratic people. So once again, I said half an hour ago that we cannot have the perfect government after only 5,000 years. I don't want to be too pessimistic, but it might take another 5,000 years to create enough aristocratic man to make a difference, because that the root solution is there.
Well, I don't think we have 5,000 years, but
that's the problem, right? We're now in the nuclear age with the power of the atom that doesn't quite give us the timeline that pre-atomic civilization had.
Right.
With
well,
around and make mistakes.
We have to solve this quickly. I don't know what that means, but
Well, that
and
means
we have to put God back into the equation also.
absolutely, or the soul, if you want, or epistemological development, because the problem is you know perfectly that there are people who are very open to religious lexicon, okay, but there are people who are not too open to religious lexicon, so we have to use a philosophical lexicon to entice them. And the soul is a word that is shared both by religiously inclined people and philosophically inclined people. By philosophy, I include science, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think you need a.
Like Igor Sikorsky said, that we have to bring our soul up to the level that we brought our reason in the 20th century. In the 21st century, we have to bring our soul up to that level, our
Said that? Igor,
spirituality.
what's his name? Igor.
Sikorsky.
I'm sorry.
I just asked who that name was. I never heard of that
Oh,
person.
Igor Sikorsky. Of Sikorsky Aircraft, Russian background. He,
Yeah.
you know, he,
The chopper.
Okay.
In all these discussions about the soul and about bringing God back into things, it has to be a new level of understanding of who God is and a new level of understanding of what our soul is. Because so many of the circles that I've been exposed to coming into the church is just another inoculation. It's just another box. And people fall into one of these little baskets and they think they have now done their duty, but they're still not truly growing as a person. What I have found in these lectures brought in these elements of classical education, the old philosophers, people that were searching for truth and making discoveries that too many of us have not been exposed to, have not known about. So we have to be able to inspire our entire culture to break out of just the survival mode and
You are
grow
correct.
as a human being, to regain our identity and to regain a genuine understanding of our creator and who he created us to be. And when we
You are
begin
correct.
doing that, then their systems of control won't work anymore.
You are correct. And until we get to that state, we're not going to be successful. We can't do it as humans alone.
And it's hard for me to figure out how to express it, but I know my own journey and coming out of the fear I lived in and actually getting to know the heart of my creator, beginning to see him for who he is and who he created me to be. And he is at work in this. That's why everybody is waking up. He has stepped in and he has said, okay, enough of this. It's time for y'all to get out of kindergarten. It's time for all of you to grow up into the magnificent beings I created you to be. He is actively at work in our world. That's why so many people are awakening. And that's why so much of the corruption is being seen. You know, there's verses in the Bible that say everything hidden in the darkness will be brought into the light. And that is exactly what we're seeing. And it's shocking. But we get to be a part of cleaning it up and then helping to raise up new systems that are more like what that city of God is supposed to be. The very character of mankind is evolving. We are growing up. We can do this. We will do this. We have to do this.
Very
for
good.
those that will come after us.
Well put, Susan.
Well put.
And on that note,
Good session, Rising Tide. I'm going to sign out.
I'm glad we got some closure to the gestalt, the idea. So I think what we're gonna do is something a little bit different. Kwan and Cynthia and myself, we had a meeting last week, and some ideas were thrown about. Obviously, we're going to be transitioning into a little bit of Plato's mind very soon on Kwan's suggestion. Either we're going to read all three of the trilogy, which I hope is possible, of the Theaetetus, Sophist, and Statesman. Maybe we're going to only read one of them because these are long, and I don't. You might spend a year doing that. I don't want to necessarily invest in a whole year of doing just that, but we'll see what happens. We'll be flexible. But before that, Juan had a couple of concepts that I'm looking forward to him unveiling and introducing insofar as it pertains to some science, some epistemological lessons embedded in some science fiction stories that a lot of us have encountered and didn't realize what was going on bubbling below the surface regarding Dune. And what's the other one by Asimov?
The Foundation trilogy.
The Foundation trilogy, which I've
Yes.
never read, nor have I read Dune, actually. I've just watched the movie, I'm embarrassed to say. So anyway, Quan, do you think
read
we're going to be introduced to that?
Yes. I would like it to be very interactive, because even if you did not read the books, okay, because I would take 10 to 15 minutes to give you a thumbnail representation of the two novels, okay? Because once again, well, I have to admit that my obsession is trying to infuse enthusiasm in people so that they want to read Plato, okay? Because one of the oligarchical trick precisely is to make you think that Plato is difficult or elitist or out of reach. It's not true, okay? Because let's not forget that Plato 25 centuries ago was in the midst of a political crisis, a little bit like what we are living today, except the nooks, okay? Except for the nooks, that's a big difference. And he created his dialogue precisely to create more aristocratic man, because the root solution is always the classical education. It's because the root solution is to create as many as possible high quality human beings that would be capable to say no to the oligarchy, okay? Not waiting, not to have food or drinks or heating before beginning to protest, okay? That you need to protest before that. So, but the Foundation trilogy and Dune are two very interesting science fiction series, conveying the everlasting fight between the closed oligarchical system and the open oligarchical system or aristocracy. And it would be a kind of entertaining, well, at least I think it would be a kind of entertaining introduction to the trilogy by Plato, Theaetetus, on true knowledge or the true epistemological growth, the Sophist, how to identify the shenanigans of the oligarchs precisely, and the statement, okay? A specific case of episteme, of true knowledge, but in the case of politics, of how to create the right city with justice ruling in that city.
Cool. Looking forward to it, Quan. So I'm gonna actually take what you just said. I'm gonna make it a little snippet of a standalone little thing for a promo to try to get some more people in.
Okay.
Are you gonna do this in one class or two?
Probably in one class it would be enough, but I would see if there is a lot of interaction. Suppose that we have 2 hours, I would like to talk only for 30 minutes, and the rest would be enthusiastic interaction, I hope.
We'll see if the God within finds us. All right, good. Bye, everybody.
Ciao.
I'll happily talk about those two books, Juan.
Yeah, okay, Paul. I expect you to come and to be a good person for the interaction.
Yeah, I'll be very interested to listen to it and to interact as much as I can. Yes.
Cool.
Enjoyed both books.
Okay, cool. Bye-bye.
Bye.